She judged the woman by her clothes, not her craft. Now, everyone's asking, who really created this masterpiece? The sun hung high over the rolling hills of the countryside, casting soft golden rays across a sprawling vineyard estate nestled between ancient oaks and lavender fields. It was the kind of summer afternoon that seemed to pause time quiet, warm, with the air thick with the scent of ripening grapes and distant honeysuckle. The soft rustle of leaves danced on the wind, weaving through rows of vines, brushing gently against cream-colored canopies and silk ribbons tied with care. Tovalement was a place known for hosting weddings that were less events and more productions. Today was no different, that the estate buzzed like a hive, every corner alive with last-minute arrangements. Vendors scurried up and down cobbled pathways, their arms filled with linens, champagne flutes, and silver place cards, bearing calligraphy in shimmering gold ink. The sound of soft string music drifted from the main hall, where musicians rehearsed a waltz that would later guide the bride down the aisle. Everything, every glass, every flower, every fork was placed with surgical precision. In the distance, staff in black uniforms moved like shadows, adjusting napkin folds under Juliet Sinclair's exacting eye. She stood tall in a flowing satin robe, a clipboard in one hand, a phone in the other, barking final orders to her exhausted wedding planner. With platinum blonde hair swept into a tight bun and pearl earrings glinting in the sun, Juliet looked every bit the heiress she was born into. Old money, accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted, and unbending in her pursuit of perfection. The guest list read like a Forbes gala: CEOs, political donors, gallery owners, and a retired movie star or two. No one was spared scrutiny. Everything had to be flawless, curated not just for her memory, but for the photos. Especially the photos. She swept through the venue like a storm cloud wrapped in silk, pausing only to point out imperfections: a slightly wrinkled tablecloth, the wrong shade of blush in the welcome bouquet, the butter being too warm. "Where's the florist?" Juliet demanded, her voice sharp as a snapped twig. Mrs. Ellison, the planner, mid-50s patient, practical, glanced nervously at her clipboard. "She should be arriving now. Her name is Amara Fields. She's..." But before she could finish, a vintage pickup truck turned down the gravel drive. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't branded, it was simply The truck came to a stop under the shadow of a cypress tree, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, graceful in a quiet sort of way, dressed in loose linen pants and a soft cream blouse rolled at the sleeves. Her hair was wrapped in a patterned scarf, her skin glowed like polished bronze in the afternoon light. She moved with calm certainty, as if she were not merely entering a job site, but stepping into a canvas already forming in her mind. Amara Fields. She opened the back of the truck and began carefully unloading wooden crates filled with greenery: fresh-cut peonies, wild foxglove, ivy, wisteria, roses the color of tea-stained silk, and sprigs of eucalyptus. Not a single flower looked plastic or planned. They looked like they had been gathered at dawn, kissed by morning dew. Juliet froze. She stared at the florist from across the courtyard, her lips slightly parted in disapproval. She took a slow step forward, heels tapping sharply on stone. "Excuse me," Juliet said, voice cool. "Who are you?" Amara paused, her hands gently cradling a bundle of climbing jasmine. She looked up, offering a kind but professional smile. "I'm Amara Fields. I'll be handling the floral installation." There was a beat of silence. Juliet blinked once, twice. "No, I don't think so." Mrs. Ellison stepped in quickly. "Juliet, I told you Amara is one of the best in the state. She's been featured in..." I said no. Juliet's voice cut through the courtyard. "This isn't what I pictured. I wanted elegance, not someone bringing weeds in a truck." A tense hush fell over the staff nearby. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Amara stood tall, still holding the jasmine. She didn't flinch. Her voice remained level, calm. "These aren't weeds. They're native blooms. I chose them to complement the land, its history, its soul." Juliet scoffed. "I didn't ask for poetry. I asked for roses and peonies in ivory, blush, and champagne, neatly arranged, predictable, controlled." Amara gently lowered the flowers to the grass. "I understand." She turned to leave, her steps measured, but Mrs. Ellison placed a hand on her arm. "Please," she whispered. "She doesn't know. Just do what you do. Show her." Amara looked back once at the vineyard, the stones, the way the light filtered through the leaves overhead, and she stayed. with the sun still bright overhead and the ceremony hours away. She began her quiet work, not to please the bride, but to awaken something in the space that had long been forgotten. Juliet Sinclair had never been told no without a follow-up apology. She was the kind of woman whose footsteps echoed even across grass, whose presence made people sit straighter, speak softer, question their own decisions. The Sinclair name was known in circles where reputations were currency and appearances were gospel. Raised in the marble halls of Charleston's elite, Juliet had been taught from childhood that the world was claimant to be molded to her taste. She was stunning, in a cold sculptural way, cheekbones, sharp posture, regal, every movement deliberate. Even now, pacing the courtyard in her ivory satin robe and designer slippers, she exuded the practiced elegance of someone who curated every detail of her life to be seen, admired, and envied. Weddings, to Juliet, were not sacred unions. They were public statements, reflections of status, proof of taste, and nothing was allowed to feel out of place. Behind her followed Mrs. Ellison, clipboard in hand, her bun slightly looser now than it had been that morning. A veteran of high society weddings, she had survived screaming mothers, collapsing cakes, and even a groom who disappeared the morning of. Yet, none of that had prepared her for the hurricane that was Juliet Sinclair. But Ellison had learned long ago that resistance was useless with women like Juliet. The trick wasn't to oppose but to redirect, nudge, guide, quietly fix what was broken before anyone noticed. And that's exactly why she'd hired Amara Fields. Amara had no storefront, no billboards. Her name wasn't tagged in influencer posts, but in the quiet corners of the industry among seasoned planners and retired artists her reputation was mythic. She didn't just decorate, she transformed. She didn't follow trend, she followed feeling, season, space. Her designs breathed, wept, whispered. In her 40s now, Amara had long stopped chasing approval. Her eyes were deep and observant, her skin radiant beneath the summer sun, and she wore clothes made for movement, soft linen pants, cotton wraps, earth-toned scarves. Everything about her felt rooted, calm, like she carried the stillness of a forest. Wherever she went, she was already halfway through arranging a delicate structure of intertwined branches and wisteria near the ceremony arch when she felt it, that change in the air. Juliet. Amara didn't look up right away. She didn't need to. She could sense the tension, thick as humidity, as Juliet's heels clicked closer, followed by the tight silence that always surrounded her. I thought we agreed on a uniform color palette. Juliet's voice sliced through the stillness. This looks like something out of a storybook picnic. Amara stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. The vines here are native. I chose them to blend with the natural curve of the vineyard. The color story will deepen once the light shifts later this afternoon. Golds, ambers, soft lilac in shadow. Juliet blinked. Are you speaking in riddles? Mrs. Ellison stepped in, voice calm. She's speaking as an artist, which is exactly what you asked for when you said you wanted the most unforgettable wedding in Valorant history. But Juliet wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the jasmine garland, the driftwood arch, the cascade of soft mosses along the stone ledge. Too wild, too raw, too real. I want this redone, she said flatly. This isn't a meadow, it's a vineyard. We're not hosting woodland creatures. Amara didn't argue. She never did. She simply returned to her crates, fingers grazing petals that had traveled hours to get here, each one chosen for its texture, its bend in the heat, its fragrance at dusk. Let her work, Ellison whispered to Juliet when they were out of earshot. You wanted timeless. She is timeless. Juliet rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath, but she didn't stop. Amara again in the background. Standing quietly by the fountain was Greg, the groom. Tall, lean, with the quiet stillness of someone who'd seen war and come back changed. Greg was a former military medic. Where Juliet was fire and frost, Greg was earth-steady, unshaken. He watched the entire exchange unfold without interrupting, not because he agreed, but because he had long learned the futility of stepping between Juliet and her expectations. Still, his eyes followed Amara. He watched how gently she handled the vines, how thoughtfully she arranged even the smallest bud. There was reverence in her work, like she was speaking a language most people had forgotten. And in that moment, a flicker of doubt passed through him, not about Amara, but about what this wedding truly represented. He turned his gaze to Juliet, was now fussing with the place cards, her voice sharp and impatient. He loved her, or at least the idea of who she had been when they met. But now, as the hours ticked closer to the ceremony, he couldn't help but feel something was off, misaligned, like two puzzle pieces pressed together by force. His eyes drifted back to the woman in linen. Amara had knelt again, tucking sprigs of rosemary into the crevices of a stone wall, the green brushing against soft purple blooms. The breeze caught her scarf, fluttering it like a ribbon dot, and for a moment, just a moment, Greg smiled. She didn't just make things beautiful, she made them feel alive. The gravel crunched softly under Amara's boots as she returned from the truck, arms full of wildflowers that spilled over the edge of a weathered wooden crate. Larkspur, cosmos, sweet pea, and sprigs of mint. The blooms danced gently in the summer breeze, their petals fluttering like silk against the sun. Tucked in the crook of her arm were lengths of hand-dyed ribbon, faded mauve and forest green colors drawn from the surrounding hillsides. She moved with quiet focus, placing her crates one by one near the ceremony site. Around her, staff bustled, folding chairs, testing microphones, adjusting lights. She was a still point in the swirl of motion, calm, intentional. But then, her voice pierced the air like a knife through linen. "Waiter, is that the florist?" Amara paused, lifting her head slowly. Across the courtyard, Juliet stood frozen in place, eyes narrowed in disbelief. Her arms were crossed tightly, the silk of her robe catching the light. Her mouth curled in something between a sneer and a scoff. "No," Juliet said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Absolutely not." The nearby staff glanced at each other uncomfortably, suddenly more interested in their checklists. Mrs. Ellison, who had been double-checking the table assignments, looked up in alarm and approached quickly. "Juliet," she said under her breath, "please don't make a scene." But Juliet was already storming toward them, her heels echoing sharply across the stone tiles. She stopped a few feet from Amara, arms still crossed. "This is not what I asked for," she declared. Amara met her gaze, calm but steady, her hands still resting on the wooden crate. "You asked for a floral transformation that feels alive," Amara replied softly. "That's what I do," Juliet scoffed. "I said I wanted someone refined, someone with taste. This isn't a farmer's market." The words landed heavy, like stones in a still pond. Amara stood there, perfectly still, as if even her breath refused to stir. Her jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. She had heard this tone before, the assumption, the dismissal, the narrowing of possibility based on nothing more than skin and simplicity. Mrs. Ellison stepped in, her voice low and urgent. "Juliet, please. Amara's worked with some of the most exclusive venues in the state. Her work is extraordinary." Juliet turned, her tone still sharp. "Then why haven't I heard of her? Why doesn't she have a website or a PR team? I wanted someone elegant, not someone who looks like she forages in the woods." Silence followed, the kind of silence that feels personal. Amara's fingers flexed once around a spray of Queen Anne's lace before she gently set it down. She straightened her posture, not out of pride, but out of preservation, the same quiet strength she had taught herself as a young woman trying to survive in rooms that never made space for her. She turned toward Mrs. Ellison. "It's all right," she said quietly. "I don't want to be where I'm not welcome." She reached for the ribbon, gathering the corner of the cloth she had unfurled. Around her, the flowers remained still beautiful, still ready to bloom, but she had already begun to pack them back into their crates. Mrs. Ellison looked torn, her fingers twitching at her sides. "Amara, wait." Amara paused, but didn't. "Look up. I've worked with you for 10 years, Ellison said, her voice tight with frustration. "You've turned bare rooms into dreams. You've made me cry more than once over a bouquet, and I've seen it all." Still, Amara didn't respond. Mrs. Ellison stepped forward, lowering her voice to a plea. "Please, don't let her ignorance dim your light. Just do what you do. Give her no reason to doubt you." There was a long pause, and then Amara looked up. Her eyes deep, quiet, reflective, held, not anger, but something stronger, resolve. She exhaled slowly, then nodded once. "I don't work to prove myself," she said softly. "I work to honor the space." Juliet stood at a distance now, arms still folded, muttering something under her breath as she turned her back and returned to the reception tent. She didn't want to see wildflowers. She wanted florals that screamed money, that whispered exclusivity and echoed symmetry. But Amara wasn't listening to her. She was listening to the land as the sun shifted in the sky. She ran her fingers across the old stone wall, felt the crevices where vines used to grow untamed. She noticed where the golden light hit around 5 p.m., bathing the ceremony arch in honey. She heard the quiet bubbling of the nearby fountain, the way it softened the atmosphere with rhythm and peace. And then, without another word, she began, again, not for the bride, but for the space, for the story it wanted to tell, one blossom at a time. The hum of the estate settled into a steady rhythm as afternoon light drifted lower across the hills. The sun, still warm, cast long shadows that stretched lazily across cobblestone paths and glinted off the edges of wineglasses already set in place. Juliet Sinclair had retreated into the reception tent, now obsessing over the font on the seating chart and the precise angle of each table setting. Her demands came rapid fire. The name cards are 2 millimeters too far left. Who chose these forks? Are they even polished? Greg Espetonier, better not be too rustic. Her voice snapped like a taut ribbon, ready to tear. But the courtyard, now bathed in golden light, felt like another world entirely. Amara moved quietly, almost reverently, her presence a stark contrast to the chaos nearby. She didn't refer to the printed mood board Juliet had emailed 2 months ago, photos of sterile white centerpieces, symmetrical arches, and uninspired Pinterest trends. Instead, Amara stood at the edge of the vineyard and closed her eyes. Breathing in, she felt the age in the earth beneath her feet. The land here had stories, whispers in the stone walls, laughter trapped in the cracks of the cobbled path. This place wasn't a blank canvas, it had soul, and it deserved more than imitation elegance. Amara opened her eyes and began. She ran her fingers along the curved vine trellises, noting how they naturally wrapped around the wooden posts like lovers holding on. Near the base of an ancient oak tree, she clipped a cluster of wild clematis in soft lavender hues, their tendrils graceful and imperfect. She layered them into the base of the ceremony arch, letting them fall as they wish. Tongue-trained, unbothered, a trailing garland of eucalyptus was next, weaved not in harsh symmetry, but following the wind's rhythm. Beneath the altar, she laid hand-picked moss, soft and damp to the touch, like nature's carpet. A few rosemary sprigs were tucked among the stones, not for visual effect, but for scent. When the couple would walk down the aisle, the herb's grounding fragrance would rise with each step. Crates opened like treasure chests at her side. Not a single bloom was artificial in tone or composition. Ivory garden roses curled with age around their edges, as if they'd been awake longer than the others. Larkspur in soft blues nodded like prayers whispered in secret. She didn't arrange flowers, she gave them permission to exist as they were. Across the estate, Juliet was entirely unaware. She hadn't stepped foot near the reception hall or altar again. In her mind, it was a closed matter. Amara would probably fix it, or Mrs. Ellison would hire someone to rework it overnight. It no longer mattered. What mattered were the finishing touches in the bridal suite, the lighting in the photo area, and ensuring her dress had the right silhouette under natural light. She dismissed Greg's attempt to bring her a chilled drink with a half smile. "I'm fine. Everything just needs to stay under control." But Greg had seen what she hadn't. Earlier, he'd wandered down the stone steps to where Amara had begun her work, unnoticed. He hadn't spoken, only watched from a distance as she gently pushed a cart of blooms across the gravel and into the shadowed garden near the altar. Something about the way she worked, her hands steady, her body moving with the rhythm of the wind and light, quieted him. There was a softness she brought to the space, as if every branch and blossom had been waiting for her hand to guide them home. He'd intended to thank her for staying, apologize, even, but something about the stillness around her made him stay silent. He didn't want to disturb it. Now, as Juliet barked new instructions about the champagne placement and raged at a wrinkled linen on the dessert table, Greg's thoughts lingered on the woman among the flowers. Back outside, Amara continued to build. She looped soft silk ribbon between the altar beams, dyed in hues drawn from the vineyard itself. Dusty rose, olive, a barely there plum. She hung delicate glass orbs with tiny candles inside, barely visible in daylight. But she knew that as dusk fell and the sun dipped behind the hills, those little flames would blink alive like fireflies. Mrs. Ellison stood nearby, watching from a distance now. Her clipboard hung limp at her side, forgotten. Her chest rose with a slow breath as she took in the space Amara had touched. It was becoming something beyond what she had hoped, and she had hoped for a miracle. A pair of caterers carrying platters paused mid-step near the reception archway, jaws slack. "You seen anything like this before?" One of them whispered, the other just shook his head. "It's like the vineyard's dreaming." Amara didn't hear them. She was lost in the work. Her brow glistened with sweat, but she paid it no mind. Each stem was placed, not for spectacle but for harmony. The space was beginning to hum, a quiet energy, building like a song just reaching its crescendo. But Juliet remained distant, blind to what was happening just beyond the silk curtain that separated her from the world she thought she controlled. The venue was changing, and so was the story. Piece by piece, petal by petal, Amara wasn't just building a floral display, she was crafting a revelation. The vineyard had begun to hush. The sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting the sky in hues of soft rose, gold, and the faintest lavender, exactly the palette Amara had drawn from, without ever needing a paint chip or a Pinterest board. Evening had arrived gently, wrapping the estate in warmth and shadow. Guests began to arrive in elegant clusters, heels clicking on stone, soft chatter rising like birdsong. Designer dresses swept across the gravel paths. Laughter rang out as old friends reunited under twinkle. Each group was greeted with a flute of champagne and ushered toward the reception hall, and then slowly, like a tide turning, the mood shifted. It began with the sound of gasping, not dramatic, not performative, but genuine, breathless awe. At the entrance of the reception hall, people stood still, eyes wide, hands rising instinctively to their hearts or mouths. The space, so plain, so cold just hours earlier, had been utterly, irrevocably transformed. Wildflowers cascaded from the ceiling like a living chandelier. Soft wisteria dripped from oak beams, swaying slightly with the breeze that whispered in through open French doors. Eucalyptus vines spiraled down from the rafters and wrapped lovingly around carved wooden posts. Every table was a work of art, in linen the color of riverstone, layered with moss runners, golden cutlery, and delicate floral clusters that looked as though they had simply grown into place. Floating orbs of glass hovered above the tables, each one cradling a tiny flame. As the sun filtered through stained glass panes and crystal goblets, light scattered like diamonds across petals, still kissed with dew. It didn't feel decorated. It felt enchanted, like nature had tiptoed in during the afternoon and decided to stay. Even the air smelled different, floral, fresh, with a hint of rosemary and something earthy that made the space feel alive. One guest whispered, "It's like a forest cathedral." Another murmured, "No designer did this. This feels ... sacred." Mrs. Ellison stood near the back, her eyes welling with tears she wouldn't allow to fall. She'd been in this business 23 years. She had never seen anything quite like it. And then Juliet arrived. She stepped through the archway, with Greg at her side, her fitted gown trailing behind like a whisper. Her face was composed, sculpted, ready for her grand entrance, until she saw the room. She stopped, her breath caught in her throat. The air shifted around her. The noise of the guests, the soft music playing somewhere in the background, all of it blurred into silence. She stared, eyes slowly scanning the ceiling, the flowers, the golden candlelight flickering off moss-lined tables, the subtle symmetry of chaos, the unspoken elegance in the asymmetry. Everything was perfect, but not in the way she had demanded. It was better. It was alive. Her lips parted just barely. Her eyes, ringed with carefully applied mascara, shimmered as tears pooled without warning. "Who?" she breathed, voice fragile. "Who did this?" Greg, still beside her, didn't answer at first. He simply looked at her for the first time that day. Then he turned his gaze to the garden beyond the open doors, where the last of the light framed Amara's silhouette as she adjusted a single lantern. Unaware of the reaction inside, he spoke softly but firmly. "The woman you sent away." Juliet turned, eyes following his line of sight. Amara stood alone beneath the oak canopy she had dressed in blooms. Her linen sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair still wrapped in the same earth-toned scarf. She was wiping soil from her hands with a quiet grace, not expecting recognition, not waiting for applause. Juliet blinked rapidly, the reality sinking in. This was not a production. This was not branded, rehearsed beauty. This was truth. This was what happens when someone doesn't try to impress, but to connect to the land, to the air, to the soul of a place. She took a step forward, then another, Her voice trembled as she spoke again, this time to herself. I didn't see it. Greg's eyes didn't leave her. No, he said gently. You didn't want to. Around them, guests continued to drift through the space in hushed wonder, their eyes still lifted toward the hanging florals, their hands trailing reverently over petal and vine. Some didn't even speak, they simply stood still, hearts moved by a beauty they hadn't expected to find. Juliet stood frozen, in the threshold of her own reception, and for the first time that day, she had nothing to say. The sun had dipped below the hills now, leaving behind a soft violet glow that stretched across the sky like a silk veil. The golden light that had illuminated the reception just moments ago now gave way to the warm flicker of lanterns and candlelight. The vineyard breathed in twilight, the whole estate aglow in a quiet kind of magic. Inside, guests were still marveling at the transformation. Some took photos, but most simply stared, stunned into reverence. Every inch of the space carried an intimacy that no budget or mood board could have conjured. But Juliet couldn't focus on them. She had barely spoken since Greg's quiet revelation, the woman you sent away. She had looked at Amara for the first time, not with the eyes of someone appraising a vendor, but with the stunned recognition that she had misjudged something extraordinary. Her hands trembled slightly now, still clutching the lace of her gown, her heart thudding unevenly beneath layers of silk and pride. She needed to find her. So she slipped away out the side of the reception tent, through the narrow gravel path that led to the garden near the ceremony arch. Lanterns glowed softly along the trail, their flames dancing as the breeze stirred. She moved slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she reached the place where it all began. Amara was there still, in her linen clothes, still barefoot on the cool earth, now that the evening air had settled. Her scarf had slipped slightly, and wisps of her curls caught the golden light like a halo. She stood by a small tree just beyond the altar, one hand resting on its low branch, as if greeting an old friend. Juliet hesitated, then stepped forward. Amara turned before she spoke. She had sensed her. Their eyes met, one pair wide and uncertain, the other calm and knowing. Juliet swallowed. I wanted to say thank you, and to apologize. I didn't know what you were doing. I didn't see it. Amara offered a small, patient smile. You weren't supposed to, not at first. Juliet stepped closer. But it's more than just beautiful. It feels like it's always been this way. Amara looked out at the altar wrapped in moss and rosemary, at the vines that curved like poetry against wood beams. It's because it has, she said softly. Juliet tilted her head, confused. Amara's gaze remained distant, anchored in memory. My grandparents used to own part of this land, right where the vineyards begin, near the old well. Juliet's lips parted, stunned. This land, this estate. Amara nodded. Long before it became a wedding destination or was listed in glossy magazines, my grandfather planted plum trees near the slope. You can still see one of them if you walk far enough. My grandmother used to grow herbs and wildflowers here. She taught me the names of every bloom we'd find. This place was our world for a while. Juliet's breath hitched. But what happened? Amara's voice remained soft, but carried weight. Developers, rising taxes, paperwork that confused and divided. One year we were tending the land. The next, we were watching trucks roll in with wine barrels and cement. Juliet stood in stunned silence. I don't come here often, Amara continued, gently, but when I saw the address, I knew, and I thought maybe this was my chance to breathe life back into it, just for a day. She turned to Juliet now, eyes kind but unwavering. I didn't just arrange flowers, she said. I told a story. Our story. One that was almost erased. I used the same rosemary my grandmother once used in her kitchen, the moss from near the spring they used to bathe in, the wisteria that still clings to the old well wall. Juliet's throat tightened. Shame pressed into her like a weight. All day, she had demanded control, rejected beauty she couldn't define, pushed away a woman whose hands held not just talent, but history. I misjudged you, Juliet whispered, her voice trembling. I saw ... what I wanted to see. I thought elegance came from polish, but this was soul. Amara gave no smug reply, only silence, gentle, firm, and dignified. After a moment, she knelt to gather a few fallen petals near the arch, her hands tender, movements slow. Elegance, she said, barely above a whisper, is what endures, not what glitters. Juliet lowered herself to the grass beside her, the hem of her gown pooling in the moss. For the first time that day, she didn't care if it wrinkled. She looked up at the arch, the flickering lanterns, the soft shadows stretching beneath ancient trees. Everything felt different now. Softer. Deeper. She looked back at Amara, tears in her eyes once more, not for the flowers, but for everything she hadn't known she was missing. "Would you," she began, hesitating, "would you stay for the ceremony?" As a guest, Amara studied her for a long moment, then offered a gentle nod. "I think," she said with a small smile, "my grandparents would like that." The sun had long dipped behind the hills, and now the vineyard shimmered beneath string lights and the flicker of 100 candles. Warm laughter floated on the air like music. Glasses clinked. The scent of roses, eucalyptus, and sweet grape lingered with every breeze. Inside the reception hall, a golden hush settled as Juliet rose to give her speech. She looked radiant, her sleek gown catching the light. Her blonde hair swept into effortless waves, but there was a different kind of glow about her now, not the curated elegance of old money or Instagram perfection. This glow came from something more human, something stripped of pride. She stepped up to the mic and took a quiet breath, her eyes scanning the room full of family, friends, and curious anticipation. "Before I say anything else," she began, her voice steady, "I need to speak from the heart." The crowd fell silent. "I spent so much time trying to make this day flawless," she said, smiling faintly, but her eyes already glistened. "I obsessed over details. I scrutinized everything. I wanted perfection on paper, but in the process, I almost ruined something real, something irreplaceable." There was a murmur in the crowd. A few exchanged glances. Greg watched from his seat, his hand resting on the table, calm and knowing. Juliet's voice wavered, but she didn't look away. "Earlier today, I dismissed someone. Not because of her talent, though it far exceeds any I've ever seen. I dismissed her because I didn't recognize her kind of elegance, because she didn't come wrapped in designer packaging, because I judged the hands." She paused, swallowing, instead of the heart behind the work. Now the room truly quieted. Even the waitstaff stopped moving. Juliet turned her head, her gaze searching, and then, near the back of the room, almost blending in with the shadows, as if she had chosen it that wasted Amara. She didn't look surprised. She looked still, like someone who had carried weight long enough to know when it was finally being lifted. Juliet offered a nod, humble and sincere. "Amara Fields didn't just decorate this space," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She transformed it. She gave it life, history, legacy. She brought something to this day that no spreadsheet or Pinterest board ever could." The applause began slow, hesitant, then it grew. A few guests stood, then more, a wave of clapping, nodding, even tears. It wasn't just for the bride's honesty, it was for the woman who had elevated the very air they breathed tonight. Amara didn't bow. She didn't beam. She simply smiled, quiet and graceful, and offered a small nod of thanks. Later, as the music swelled and couples drifted onto the dance floor, a line began to form near where Amara stood. A woman with silver hair in a navy satin dress was the first to reach her. "You don't happen to travel to the coast, do you? My daughter's wedding is in October." Next came a couple from Atlanta. He was in finance. She worked in publishing. "We've never seen anything like this," the woman gushed, eyes wide. "Do you take bookings for corporate events too?" By the time the third guest approached with a business card already in hand, Amara had to gently laugh. Gracefully, she tucked the card into her linen pocket, never boastful, only grateful. Outside, beneath the stars, Greg found Juliet, standing quietly near the ceremony arch. The moss still clung softly to its base, now lit only by moonlight. "She stayed," he said gently. Juliet looked at him, then smiled. "I'm glad." Greg tilted his head. "You okay?" Juliet took a deep breath. "I think for the first time in a long time, yes." They stood together in silence, hands brushing. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" she asked quietly. "She already has," Greg replied. As the evening wore on, Amara slipped away from the noise. She wandered down a small dirt path toward the edge of the property, where the land sloped gently into a line of plum trees, gnarled, old, still standing. She reached one and rested her palm against the bark. The same trees her grandfather had once tended. Her other hand held a single candle she'd taken from the reception hall. She knelt at the base of the tree, pressed her fingers into the soil, and let the silence speak, for the land, for the stories, for the dignity she had never once let go of, even when others had tried to strip it from her. She lit the candle and let it flicker at the tree's roots. Then she stood, brushed the earth from her knees, and turned back toward the vineyard, toward the future. Moral of the story: true elegance doesn't wear labels. It grows from legacy, humility, and the courage to create beauty from memory. Sometimes, the most exquisite things are made by hands the world overlooks until they bloom in the light.